Thank you again for that generous introduction. We heard from the Honorable Minister of State for Commerce and Industry and Electronics and Information Technology, Shri Jitendra Prasad ji. Mr. Chengatai Masango, Head of the UN Secretariat for the IGF. Professor Rekha Jain, Senior Visiting Professor from ICRIER. Professor Rajat Moona, Director of IIT Gandhinagar, and present here on the dais. Shri Shivnath Tukral, Vice President Public Policy in Meta. Ms. Amrita Chaudhary, Director of CCAOI. Shri Dilsher Singh Mali, Founder and CEO of Zupi, who gave us an idea of what youthful entrepreneurship is all about in this country, and my colleague in the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Shri Sushil Pal. I think it's the event started with a very good recollection of what was discussed in the last edition of the IIGF and what actions have been taken. Clearly, there are a number of steps which need to be taken in order to ensure that the internet continues to remain what it today is to a huge segment of the global population and also a very, very large segment of India's own population. I still remember days when the internet was a complete novelty. No one took it all that seriously. An email would be sent and it was never regarded as a valid piece of communication till you received a signed copy of a letter. Those were the days that we recall. The internet today has replaced all of that. Modes of communication have changed. It has become the first line of communication. Today we have laws which are written as being digital first. So we are in a situation where we have adopted the digital mode of functioning into practically everything that we were doing. Large chunks of the internet were governed and administered almost entirely as a voluntary effort at a particular point in time. That was the time when we were trying to popularize the use of the internet, something which people were attempting to make sure gets adopted more widely. It's a bit like what Victor Hugo said. You can never stop an idea whose time has come. Nobody could stop it, and now everyone uses it. Everyone adopts it. It's part of what we do on an everyday basis. It's part of our life every day, every minute. Even as, many of you scroll through your phones here or look at something, you're finding information, getting information, you have things which sit in your pocket. That's how much digitalization has changed the world in the last 20 years, 25 years. That being the case, I think it's very important that something which has become an essential part of everyone's everyday life is protected, conserved, made resilient, and we ensure that it is not weaponized against us, against humankind. I think that is what is very essential. So we've moved beyond the stage where you're just trying to ensure that it gets adopted more widely. Today we have, the number was cited by Dr. Tyagi, we have 955 million users in India alone, and globally there are so many more. It has become a basic necessity for most people in their everyday life and everything that they do. Today we believe that if you're not able to submit, says, why do I need to turn up in an office, or why do I need to turn up and meet you in person? I can send you an email, I can talk to you on the phone, or at best we can do a video call and figure out what needs to happen. That is the way in which we communicate. When it has become so ubiquitous, when it has become so part of everyone's life, I think we have an even greater duty to make sure that it is kept secure, it is kept resilient, and it is not misused in a way that hurts people. So which is why there are many elements of internet governance which have suddenly become significantly more important than where they were before. And India, having so many internet users and for whom using the internet has become a way of life, for whom many people are dependent on it for incomes in a number of ways, more ways than we can actually imagine, I think is in a situation where we have to necessarily protect the way the internet is used, make sure that it is available for the good of the largest number in this country. I think that is the critical element that we need to think of, and we have to think of ways in which this can happen. Dr. Rekha Jain's presentation talked about how you actually strengthen the entire network within the country, the need to actually make broadband available. See, India, the way India consumes the internet is very different from the way the rest of the world does it. We do it on the basis of mobile data. 90% of internet access is based on mobile data connections. In the rest of the world, it's entirely the reverse. 90% is based on wired connections, broadband networks, fiber optic networks. It's been tremendous for the expansion of the internet. But in the long run, is it something which is resilient enough, or should we be investing in broadband connectivity and making sure that it goes out? That is a question which needs to be asked. We have the national fiber optic network which is being rolled out, and hopefully when that is done and there is much more connectivity through those means and more speeds and more information being consumed, it might become even more important to India's own population. So as it becomes part of that, a lot of aspects need to be tied up. Yesterday I was walking through some of the streets of Old Delhi. If you actually look up and see, and I'm sure many of you who live in different parts of Delhi would have seen it, if you actually look up and see the kind of cables which are carried along the sides of the roads, along the street lights and along the lampposts, you start wondering, is this what we are relying on? It is a complete, it's worse than a spaghetti bowl of cables, and the image is something that I can't actually take out of my mind. I think it was this thick, the number of cables, individual cables which are being carried. And how are you ever going to find out whose connection is coming through which? And many of them probably are redundant and they're just stringing on more of them. It's an informal way in which the entire internet and entire connectivity, cables and all of that have been connected across the country. Now, is that resilient enough? Is that safe enough? Is that secure enough? Is it something which will withstand various kinds of possible disruptions? We've become so dependent on it. Isn't it time that we focused on the kind of infrastructure on which it is carried and the way that it actually works for us? That is becoming significantly more and more important. That is an area where I think we need to focus on much more. Within the country, undoubtedly, the extent of the way in which we are carrying it through, the way in which we are able to offer reliable connectivity, the way in which you are able to offer reliable bandwidth is becoming virtually a necessity, and who knows, one day it might just get enacted judicially into a right. So, into an entitlement that people can have, which means that governments need to focus on this and need to focus on how to make that particular set of infrastructure much more resilient. We have a large number of submarine cables which lead the internet into the country. Now, what happens if at some point there's a disruption? Are we stable enough within the country to ensure that all the services that need to be offered to citizens of this country can be offered even in the event of a disruption? That is what internet resilience ultimately is all about. All the data that needs to be stored within this country to offer essential services. I don't mean a whole bunch of Instagram pictures. I don't really mind where they are stored, but all the financial data, all the data which relates to power utilities, all the data which relates to telecommunication utilities, a whole host of other data which is required for people to actually live their daily lives on a digitized basis as we do today? Do we have the data center capacity within the country to store all of the data that we need? Can we do it? That we need to do it is the next question. But can we do it is one question, and which we need to be prepared for, which we need to work towards, saying plan for that capacity and make sure that it is provided. Immediately it raises the issue of power. Today the biggest question is availability of power. You know that globally all the big major technology companies are trying to figure out ways in which they can secure adequate power for AI applications. And related to that is data centers. And as we adopt AI more and more, the minister pointed out the importance of adopting AI. As we adopt AI more and more, do you have enough power supply to power that? And otherwise, where do you make sure that this power supply comes up in a way that we are able to address this issue? This is again something that MeitY is looking into right now to make sure that along with the Ministry of Power, along with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy Sources and all other related agencies, we plan for this capacity to make sure that we have enough power for the data centers and for the AI compute facility that we need in this country, which will underpin what needs to be happening on the internet. These are all issues which are extremely critical. Equally, how the internet itself is used. Today, we do not have, it is very easy for anybody to open a new internet domain and squat on a particular piece of internet real estate. We were reading about, with great interest, I think, some couple of siblings, young siblings who had opened up something, a particular, on Geo, they had opened up a particular domain name, and then, it was a question of how do you sort of get them to part with it. Now that sounds amusing, it's a commercial story, but it could happen to anybody and it could happen to anything. How have we secured ourselves against that? At a time when you wanted people to open more domain names, wanted people to open more websites, it made a lot of sense to allow that freely. It made a lot of sense to make it really easy so that there was greater adoption. Now has the point of inflection come where there's been adequate adoption, and now you need to look at a situation where we are more circumspect about the way in which new websites and domain names are opened. We sort of do what nowadays is very famously called KYC to ensure that we open it only for the people who really need to do it. These are all questions which need to be addressed. Equally, in terms of infrastructure, there was talk of the standards which need to be applied, the protocols which need to be applied, the kind of say that Indian companies need to have in it. That again is Indian companies, Indian stakeholders need to have in it in order to connect up to what needs to happen. So all these become vitally important questions, and I think those are the questions which these 2 days of deliberations in the IIGF really need to address. And this is the preparation that we need for the IGF which is coming up in Riyadh, and eventually the way in which we approach the WSIS next year, because that's when the entire review of internet governance really takes place, and India really needs to take its rightful position there. And when we talk about a multi-stakeholder approach, and that's the beauty of IIGF itself, that it is a multi-stakeholder approach, I think it's very important that we sit together, discuss the issues which we need to discuss, figure out what the country's priorities need to be, what is in interest of the multiple stakeholders who are part of this setup even here in India, what each one of them requires, what are the interests that need to be protected, ways in which that overall the interest of India's internet consumers, India's internet users are fully protected, because it's no longer a matter of you have to protect it the way you protect the electricity grid. You have to protect it the way you protect any other piece of essential infrastructure that the country has. You can't treat it as just an amateur game where you just keep expanding it. It has now become essential. It has become central. In some ways, having an amorphous structure to do it, having a structure where there are a number of agencies as a community who are responsible for it, is probably good. I'm not saying it is necessarily bad. It may be a good structure to have, simply because when you have so many players, you balance each other out and you prevent anything too wrong from happening. It is possible. But we need to think about it, and we need to think about it strategically and figure out whether that is the best way to go about it and what further safeguards do you need in order for that to happen. So these are the kind of issues that I would really hope IIGF this year again focuses on, looks at these issues and figures out how we go forward. They've selected, as was said, very, very interesting themes of discussion. There is the power of artificial intelligence, which needs to be looked at. It was people have already spoken about it. My friend and colleague in the ministry, Shri Abhishek Singh, is there for the next session, and he will probably sort of talk about how we can actually use this. You have a session on resilient internet infrastructure. I would be extremely interested to see what comes out of that particular session in terms of, how we can actually design this and go forward, both from a technical and a legal perspective. That would be a very interesting area that we are concerned with. The role of the multi-stakeholder community to build a digitally empowered India. Again, multi-stakeholder in this context is extremely important. All interest groups need to be represented. Their key interests need to be protected, and the broader interests of the country itself need to be protected, and that's one way of bringing it all together. And of course, building a green and sustainable internet, green power, and especially as there will be significantly larger power requirements, how they'll be met will be an important element. So I think all of these are very critical points of discussion which need to come up, and in the Indian context, what we need to do is extremely significant. Two other issues that I would raise in the Indian context. One, of course, is language, and we have sort of pushed the point that Joint Secretary Mr. Sushil Pal already made. We've pushed globally that there needs to be greater adoption of internet-based languages. The way domain names are named and opened now is possible in 22 Indian languages, is what I understand. All of this is something which will enable greater inclusivity and greater participation in the way that the internet gets used, and in the way that people are able to take to the internet, particularly in a multilingual country like India. So that's a very positive development, and that's again something which needs a message that needs to be taken forward, because many people are probably not even aware that it is possible, and that's something which we work on. And another key element of this, of course, is the cybersecurity dimension of it. And cybersecurity on an everyday basis is becoming more and more important. And as we rely on the internet itself to actually take care of much of what happens in terms of interfaces, that becomes very important. And somewhere along the line, I think in that sense, it was briefly alluded to that when AI is used in the Indian context, we believe that the legislation is currently adequate, and I truly believe so, because when you actually read through, recently, I think last week, Financial Times carried a full-page article on how regulation of AI is becoming an issue in different countries, especially of deepfakes and so on. There are many countries which don't have adequate laws. Fortunately, in India, there are laws, and already laws on misrepresentation and things which can be used for that purpose. So that's one part of it which gets taken care of. But there's another part which doesn't get taken care of, which is, how is the responsibility fixed? In today's context of Section 79 of the IT Act, how is the responsibility fixed? Because it's an unvariegated set of internet intermediaries. So is there need for better classification? Is there need to look at, who carries how much responsibility? Because again, that's very vital in the case of the internet, because internet is a basic pipeline. It is the fundamental, and it is important for the resilience of the internet, simply because the internet itself, if you were looking at it as just a network of pipelines which will carry information flow, it deserves and it requires to have full, what we call the safe harbor. I mean, nobody who is a participant in that process, and that's what it's fundamentally intended for. But the intermediaries in the process could be many. There could be pure infrastructure technological intermediaries. There could be others who are not necessarily pure technological intermediaries, where different levels of responsibility may lie, and especially in an AI context, that responsibility may change. So that's something which needs to be examined as well, and I would love to hear from this forum as to what their thoughts on that aspect itself are, because that is something which could be an important issue on which we need to deliberate and how exactly that needs to be looked at. So these are the two other issues that I think needs to be part of the agenda of the discussions in the coming sessions. And we would be in the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology extremely interested in hearing about what the outcomes are. And we would expect, with expedition, we need to take this whole thing forward. I think we are at again, an inflection point in terms of the governance of the internet. And there are important international fora which are going to meet both in Riyadh later this month and also globally next year. And before that, we need to get our entire stance on this, on the internet governance aspect together. We have many elements of it already in place. We have been steadfast in the way that we have followed up many of these elements. And I think as a forum, as a multi-stakeholder forum, we should get everybody on the same page, literally, so that we are able to be a much more forceful voice in the international fora. And India, representing 955 internet users, has a voice which is equivalent to its population, equivalent to its importance in the globe, in the Internet Governance Forum as well. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think this is an extremely important event, and we need to work forward on this basis. You've received excellent guidance on this from the Minister and the other speakers, and I think there's a lot that you can chew on and come back to us in due course. Thank you.